Thank you again for coming to the new Models in Media and Activism panel this evening. I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion about women's representation and involvement in new and old media. Before we begin, I have a couple of brief announcements to make. First of all, you can see on the screens some tweets that are showing up. If you do want to have your tweets populate that screen, just be sure to include the hashtag, which is WAMDC, WAMDC. And the event this evening is co-sponsored both by Campus Progress, the organization for which I work, and is part of WAM It Yourself, a decentralized conference that's put together by Women, Action, and the Media, an organization that works on women's representation in the media. And events are happening all around the country and actually all around the world. WAM has some more information about ways you can become involved with them, including information about their membership program, and you can pick that up at the registration table out front. They also ask you consider becoming a donating member, and they wanted me to let you know that 75% of every donation we received for this event will be ours to use for a future WAMDC program. More information about becoming, like I said, becoming a member is available out there, and I'm happy to direct you to the right person to answer any more questions you might have. I'd also like to take a minute to thank my fellow organizers for this event and helping me to bring this to a reality. If you could just maybe stand up or wave. The three ladies in the front, Amanda, Sabrina, and Rachel, thank you so much for your help. I'd also like to, a fellow colleague of mine here at the Center for American Progress has an announcement about an upcoming flash mob event. So Sandy, if you don't mind coming up for a minute to make your announcement.
So the Center for American Progress Action Fund and the American Association of University Women have teamed up to put on a flash mob dance in honor of Equal Pay Day. It's going to be happening a week from Saturday on the National Mall, and we'd love to have as many participants as possible. What we're going to do is film the event next Saturday, and then it's going to be released on April 12th, which is Equal Pay Day. So if you're interested in participating, we have some information at the table in the back, and after the event you can stop by and sign up.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandy. Now, without further ado, I'd like to really get the panel started. As we all know, there's no question that women tend to be rarer finds than we like at the top of news organizations. And as media changes to adapt to a hybrid of news and activism and some other things, the paths to becoming a successful media personality or head of an organization are becoming increasingly complex. It's worthwhile to ask questions about how we can make media more representative of the people that live in America. This evening, our panel will be moderated by Amanda Turkle, on the right there. Amanda Turkle is a senior politics reporter at the Huffington Post. She previously served as the deputy research director at the Center for American Progress, so I know Amanda quite well, and the managing editor of thinkprogress.org. Amanda also served as the center's special assistant for strategic planning and has experience on various national and state level political campaigns and in government offices. Amanda's writings have appeared in publications including the New York Times, Politico, The Daily Beast, and Salon, and she's a regular political commentator on radio and television. Thank you so much, Amanda, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Kay. So I first wanted to introduce my fellow panelists. So right here on my left, we have LaToya Peterson, who is the owner and editor of Racialicious, which is a blog about the intersection of race and popular culture. She has a special focus on video games, anime, American comics, manga, magazines, film, television, and music. And she has been quoted in the Boston Globe, CNN, The Guardian, the New York Times, among many other publications. Next to her, we have Melinda Wittstock, who is an award-winning journalist, social evangelist, and entrepreneur. She founded the Capital News Connection in 2003 as a way to turn the Beltway inside out by making policy and politics pass the Why Should I Care test for people in local communities. It is now heard by 3.1 million people on more than 200 public radio stations. She has more than 20 years of experience in journalism, including reporting and hosting work with BBC, ABC, NPR, among other publications and outlets. And then finally, we have Amy Austin, who has been publisher of the Washington City paper for the last 10 years. Previously, she was the City paper's general manager. And it is now, if you're not familiar with the Washington City paper, you can pick it up all over the city, and it's one of the nation's most successful alternative papers, known for its journalistic integrity, comprehensive and critical coverage of the arts, and a place for local advertisers to find a great audience. And WashingtonCityPaper.com is its website, and it has more than 500,000 unique visitors each month. So thank you all for joining us here today. So first of all, I just wanted to bring up a study that came out this week, and I'm not sure if you guys saw it. It's a study by the International Women's Foundation, and it looked at media organizations worldwide and found that worldwide, 73% of the top media management jobs are occupied by men. In the United States, women make up 41% of the news workforce, which is not that bad, but fewer than 25% of the top management positions are filled by women. So for every Tina Brown we hear about, every Ariana Huffington, there are a lot more men out there in these roles. And so first of all, I would just like to ask, we'll start down here with Amy. I'd like to ask you just, why are these stats like they are? And I mean, why does it matter that people of different gender, perspective, sexuality, race, why does it matter if they're in the top positions?
Why does it matter?
Why does it matter? and how could
that would be true?
How could that? How will that change a media organization? To have these different perspectives.
Well, I think you see. I mean, you're probably anybody who's in this room probably thinks it matters, but it matters because of the different voices and stories that you can tell are definitely told from different perspectives depending on where people come from in their lives. And gender can play a big role in that. So if you're a woman, you're going to tell a different story than if you're a man. I mean, we all know that to be true. So having people at the top of the organizations or in the middle of the organizations in place where they can influence the storytelling can definitely matter.
So as someone in a top management role, though, why do you think there are so few women in those roles?
It's. I'm not sure that there's a lot of. I brought a book with me called The Edge of Change. That's Women in the 21st Century Press. That came out. It's a scholarly book with about 15 essays about women who grew up in the newsrooms. And the story that's in there is largely about how women's roles haven't fully changed in the last, 40 years, 50 years. It wasn't until the 60s that women started to have a significant role in the newsrooms. So they, you blame family, you blame people who have the power like to keep the power. Those seem to be the two themes that run through that book.
Yeah, well, I created my own news organization to get around that one, really. I don't know. I feel like I'm such a gripper. I'm looking at all the faces in the room. You guys are all quite young, relative to me. So all I know is that I started in journalism at a time when I had to sit close to the payphone, to get the story, and there was no internet, and so that I'm just dating myself there, what that was like. So being able to run fast was a very important part of being a good journalist. So these days, it just who knew, right? So, but I remember going way back, what it was like. I started out in the London Times. I was 22 as a journalist there. Very few women. And I was a specialist correspondent, which was kind of like a big deal. And we had one secretary for 4 correspondents, and I shared a secretary with 3 other guys. Okay, so she delivered and opened their mail for them and got them coffee, but she did not do that for me because I was a girl, you know what I mean? Like I could get my own coffee, thank you very much. I could open up my own mail, thank you very much. And there were these tensions between women in different roles. Women were not really supportive of each other. And there was a sense that there were these several women's jobs, and all the women were competing with each other for their women's jobs. And there were certain sectors of, certain things so that, you did as a woman. So obviously that's changed a lot. I mean, I don't see that happening anymore. And that's very exciting. But I just want to pick up on what you were saying. The type of stories, the diversity is critical because we all ask questions, even the questions we ask, which is the basis of journalism, the questions we ask are influenced by our life experience. And without being able to debate those questions, without having a diversity in a newsroom, you can never really have diverse coverage.
Cool. Clearly. I'm sitting with two media titans here. I definitely came from the new media side of the aisle, which is where a lot of people, particularly voices who have generally not been typically represented well in the media, have found a way to make our voices heard, have found a way to strike back, have found a way to correct assumptions. And I feel like just as important as it is to ask the right questions, it's also important to know what kind of assumptions people are bringing into the newsroom and what kind of bias people are filtering their journalistic coverage through. I think one of the great examples was the New York Times' recent kerfuffle around the gang rape case that they reported on. How many people are familiar with that? All right, most folks in the room. Cool. So for people who aren't familiar, there was a New York Times official article that came out about a horrific gang rape in Texas of an 11-year-old girl by roughly 18 different people. And the Times report was completely one-sided. There were all these assumptions that were in the article. He didn't put any context in about consent laws around, one 11-year-old can't consent, period. Like there's no issue of consent. That wasn't even covered in the New York Times article. And so I had done a piece for Poynter Institute, and was talking a little bit about kind of the different assumptions assumed in the New York Times piece versus the Houston Chronicle piece that also covered it. And just looking at the language used, looking at how people frame the question, looking at who's considered a reliable source. In the New York Times, they only quote people who were like, well, she dressed like she was older, and she hung out with boys at night, and clearly she was just kind of asking for it. Now, the reporter didn't say this, but he quoted, 5 or 6 people who did. Therefore, that was the tone of the article. And so when we talk about having a balanced media, a representative media, you wonder what kind of assumptions people are bringing to the table. One of the ways people get checked on assumptions is by having someone else there with a different type of experience that can, mitigate whatever they're saying, that can challenge them on it, that can push and pull. But that hasn't been happening in our media because our media is so homogenous.
And that's part of what the new media has been able to do because it's so much easier. Well, you don't think as much. You don't think that the blogosphere, certain blogs.
Okay, you should have some beef with that. But unfortunately, what I saw in what I've been seeing in new media, I've been in there since 06, 07, which sounds like nothing, right? Compared to like 2 decades. But then on the internet, that's like, you might as well measure that in dog years, right? It's like, I've been 6 years. I quote stuff that I wrote 6 years ago. Like, it's ridiculous. But one of the things I started to notice is that at Poynter, we were calling it the burgeoning fifth estate, right? So if the traditional press is the fourth estate. Folks who are doing journalism in this new media environment are the fifth estate. And we're noticing as these two are starting to blend, right? As people like Nate Silver get to go to the New York Times and do interesting things. As more and more newspapers are looking at bloggers as sources, as people to quote, as sometimes places to purloin from, happens. You're also noticing the same kind of like king-making that was happening in the fourth estate. So the same types of people are getting to move up. The same types of people are being appointed to permanent positions, job post positions, executive positions. It's the same types of people who are getting their blogs noticed as being, there's a clear gender gap in particular with a lot of discussions around political blogging, right? What does it mean to blog about politics? Well, a lot of women bloggers are put in the feminist category, right? It doesn't matter what we're actually talking about. But we're put in this feminist category, which means we're not as serious as these real issue political bloggers who aren't talking about it from a gender-specific perspective. Or for a lot of, for example, some of the mommy bloggers I know, they are very involved in politics, but they write about it from a mom perspective. Therefore, people aren't looking because it's not labeled big politics with a P, and it's also not seen as the same kind of serious politics that other people are seeing. So we're starting to see a lot of the same hierarchies reemerge in new media, and it only gets worse as it's becoming more and more corporate.
Right, I think mommy bloggers is, I'm all for mommy bloggers, but that's a way in which society talks about bloggers and sort of differentiates women and puts them in a camp that somehow makes them less powerful or less serious, as you said.
Definitely, it's kind of like the chicklet issue, right? So like if you're in publishing and you're writing a book and it's about women, and it's about young women, then, oh, it's chick lit. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Like, it could be about anything. It could be about death. It could be about grief. It could be about whatever. And yet, for some reason, it gets labeled as this one package. And it seems that some people who have this kind of ability to move between worlds, the ability to command these big book deals and, you know, have spectacular flame outs at one website and then somehow go on to another website and be fine, all tend to look like the people who are already there. And so I think you have to kind of start looking at, you know, what kind of, you know, hierarchies and dichotomies are we bringing back into new media? Because the potential is there to shake everything up, but it's not happening that way, and it won't happen that way unless we're intentional about what we do.
Right.
And also, I think that people have noticed as the blogosphere has aged that there are a few blogs now at the top, and they have been there for a long time, and it's much harder for any sort of new blog to come in, which means that it's harder for new voices to come in. I mean, you have Daily Kos now, you have Firedog Lake, you have, you know, sort of the big political blogs, and they've been there for a while, and it's hard to name a new blog that's broken through, that's been a fresh voice, and it's nothing against those blogs that have been there, but it's much harder, whereas the blogosphere was once a place where all these new voices could come, they could work themselves out, but now it's becoming more of an establishment, I think. And so I wanted to turn to, I guess, new media. What, you know, with Twitter, with Facebook, with all of that, a lot of women are using those sorts of social media. So what sort of opportunities, but also perils, do they hold for women? I think you can see a loss of privacy for a lot of women. Women are treated differently when they post a picture, when they write certain things. So I would love to get your thoughts on what sort of opportunities or perils that new media holds for women that may be different.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think like anything, like it's two sides of a coin. I mean, there's so much opportunity, and yet there is the being pushed into some sort of category as well, right? So the opportunity to me is that women can really create the type of news that they want to create, because, you know, the blogosphere, but also other, you know, Twitter and Facebook, but also something that I'm working on right now, News It, which is going to allow people to go and create news in a collaborative way, in a socially networked way, to create really hyper-relevant content that they want.
How would that work then?
Oh my goodness!
Tell us more. I want to know more about this.
Okay,
It sounds new.
Well, essentially, what I'm doing with my colleagues who are here too is that we're creating what we call a mobile social network, and the idea is that folks get together and we create sort of assignments or specific tasks for them to go do. They can suggest assignments. We suggest assignments. They sign up for specific tasks around the assignment. Someone goes and shoots video. Someone does audio. Someone does pictures. Multiple people are essentially gathered around one assignment. And then our process is essentially edit and curate that, and our processes are a mix of algorithms that get more sophisticated over time, but algorithms can't do everything. You do need sort of the algorithm in between the ears and professional journalist oversight to be able to make that content really high value, and by high value I mean accurate, high quality, of impact. And so it's just a different way of doing news that we think solves a business model problem, kind of a cost issue, but actually creates newsrooms of unusual breadth and diversity, because it brings more voices into a single story. So the idea, if you imagine 100 people on a story, and as long as all those people are very different, there's greater breadth and diversity in that story. The challenge, of course, is recruiting people in such a way that and that your contributors are going to be sufficiently different. And one of the things about the web is that everybody tends to glom around, like-minded people find like-minded people. People read what they already know, what they already want to know, what already fills their preconceived notions. And I think that's one of the things that leads to a lot of folks being slotted into various categories, like, you're talking about the mom bloggers and whatnot. So getting back to your original question, one of the things that we want to do is be able to correct that issue by not only allowing people to create content and empowering them to create the content that they really want to create, that's relevant to them, where they live and work, that's really important to them, but also to bring diverse voices into this, and the elegance is going to be in how it's very early days. So the elegance is going to be how we are able to deliver that.
Well, I think if you have models like that, the one of the advantages of new media is that there's more collaboration in social media, where people are adding on to the story in Twitter feeds and other ways. So, and women are much more prone to collaboration than men. So that might be good for us.
I don't know, I guess fighting in the trenches of social media makes you a little bit more jaded about kind of how things go and how people share. We don't really share. We hate each other. So one of the things, yeah, it is. There's a lot of cutthroat kind of like, ribbing, and it doesn't have to be a gender-based thing. But what I do notice, particularly about women who are online, and my friend Christina Zhu, who runs RaffleCon, which is like a conference about internet culture, wrote about this very recently in a piece that we cross-posted, and she talked about how women online are examined in this very particular way that men will almost never have to face. So you have women like Boxy, who she was quoting, which is the most prominent female user on 4chan, who will never link her real-life identity with what she's doing online, even though other very established 4chan is like I don't even know how to describe 4chan. I'm just going to let that go. But it's a community online, and sometimes it's not very nice. Let's put it that way. But, other 4chaners have been able to capitalize on their internet fame and parlay that into other opportunities, where she has been too concerned about her real-life identity to ever do so. The same thing happened a few years back with Kathy Sierra, who was a user experience designer, which I'm not sure if everybody knows what that is, but it's like the most non-offensive job in the world. You're like, how do we make this more friendly for our users? Can we make the buttons easier? Can we make, it's not offensive. And she was getting death threats and hate mail and getting bullied by other really prominent bloggers, and it sparked this whole thing. And it talked a lot about this culture online where women who just stand out, period, get hacked down. The stakes are just a little bit different for us. And, even on our blog, right, we had, our blog is primarily run by women. Right, we have one feminist dude who's who's helping us at the helm, but it's primarily run by women. And we had a guest contributor writing kind of about just microaggressions and racism in her everyday life. Like these things, this is again not surprising. She wasn't pioneering super controversial new ground. She was talking about things like going into a store and being ignored, and then coming back with her white husband, and suddenly not only are they still ignoring her, but they're talking to him. But suddenly she's also a person worthy to be talked to because she's standing next to him. And so having that discussion about these things happening. And not being able to articulate that. And for that reason, a commenter felt like it would be totally appropriate not only to, attack her in the comments, but also to try to figure out who she was, to leave messages on her blog about her children and where they go to school and where her home was. We had to report it to FBI cybercrimes. And it was really weird. Like when that was happening, we posted a big notice that was like, look, this will not be tolerated. Like, we're not going to have it. Because part of the reason why these crimes proliferate is because people suffer in silence. They don't speak out about it, or they allow it to happen. So a lot of people saw what was happening with Kathy Sierra, but not a lot of people wanted to intervene until it got to the point where she was like, I'm not speaking anymore because I'm too afraid to leave my house.
So who's targeting? I mean, is it mostly men or is it other women? I mean, who's behind
with
this?
The Kathy Sierra situation, it was really weird. It was a mix of men and women who were other prominent bloggers who were doing it under their own names. Like, this was not one of these online commenter type things.
These were actual other bloggers who were just competing.
Right, who were either competing, and some of them were just tech observers. And they just felt like she was so ridiculous that they had to make death threats about her, that they had to mail horrible pictures of her to her house, they had to Photoshop her head on, pornographic images. Like, they did all of these horrible things to her just because of who she was. And so women do have to navigate this environment differently, which sucks because we shouldn't have to do that, just like we shouldn't have to pay attention to where our drink is all the time. We shouldn't have to do these things. And yet this new media environment has allowed more ways for you to become very, very vulnerable, particularly if you're, if you have a job, if you have a life outside of the online world that you might want to protect.
And I think that, I've had some women tell me that has made them more nervous about getting into blogging, because you're not just a byline like you would be in a newspaper decades ago. You're out there, you have to be a presence on Twitter, you may have to go on TV. The blogging in many ways is very narcissistic. It's very, about the person. And many women have said, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't know about you, but I know that a lot of the hate mail I get, and I get a lot of it, is often commenting on my gender, is often commenting on my race that my white male colleagues don't get. And it just sort of adds that extra level of scary to already crazy emails. And I keep them all in a folder just in case I ever need a record of it. But I think, many women are therefore more nervous to become public faces. And they've mentioned that and said, how do you deal with that? So building on that, is there anything, starting out in journalism that you wished you would have known and that, maybe anyone here starting out that could help them.
Oh boy, how long do you have? I mean, I don't know. You go first. No, I mean, I have such a long list. I would do a lot of things over, but.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, there's a lot of things I would have done differently. I think the lesson that, the lessons that you learn are often the lessons you have to keep learning them. So if you're moving, if we have an opportunity to hire, that's always been a difficult situation. Trying to get the diversity in a newsroom, City Paper has a really small newsroom, so we don't have hundreds of reporters. We have, now we have 12, maybe 10. So we have very limited slots, and you're balancing finding the most talented person you can at the price we can pay against finding diversity and voices. So, I've made decisions I wish I wouldn't have made, balancing those two things.
That's tricky. I mean, some of the things that, just going back a little bit, one of the things that used to work in my favor, in a weird way, or I found a way to make it work in my favor, was to be deliberately underestimated by male sources, like way back. Because they'd be like, you'd ask some question and just pretend that you just didn't understand. Oh, please explain more. Oh, please explain. And you'd end up getting great quotes. I mean, that doesn't work so much anymore. So, but actually, and because they just completely, there was so much, you could use the sort of the actual quite blatant sexism in a way. You could kind of use it to your advantage as a reporter. In terms of hiring with Capital News Connection, I mean, we've been always tried really hard to have a diverse newsroom, and the recruiting isn't necessarily easy either. And so you can try, but are you, do you have the right channels to be able to reach people? Is it a job that they actually want to run around, Congress, doing 20 stories for public radio every day? Do the public radio stations, the public radio audience, which Capital News Connection has been working within that milieu, we have to hire reporters that the stations like, because they're our sort of paying customers. And public radio always talks about the need to be more diverse, but frankly, it's not. Its audience is not diverse, and its staff is not diverse. And so, I don't know, every year I go to at least 3 conferences a year that are public radio conferences. There's always a panel about diversity. There's always like one non-white on the panel talking about the need for diversity. I mean, like, I don't know. I just feel like the biggest thing about like mistakes or things that you want to learn from is, do you actually learn from them? And sometimes I feel like I'm in a deja vu all over again, which is frustrating.
Bang on right there, because this is what I found, right? Let me preface the comments this way. We're going to talk a little bit about how to come into the front door of journalism, and then how to come into the back door of journalism, because they came into the front door and I came into the back door. So very different types of experiences. But to touch on that diversity point for a second, I strongly have started to believe, after 6 years being in the game, after 3.5 years doing this mostly professionally, to the point where I can support myself from writing. Who knew that many people cared about vampire sex, that I would have a whole career? But such is life. So that's what I have. But one of the things that I started to notice is that people keep saying that they care about diversity. It's our value. We care. Nobody cares about diversity. If they cared about diversity, they would have it. Because you would start examining kind of like, what are the portals and channels that I'm using to try to attract people? How is that not working for who I'm getting? And let's figure out how we change this. Racialicious does not pay because we are not funded. There is no, like, people seem to think that we produce things daily. And since we do have some modicum of professionalism, which we throw out the window at every chance we get, they tend to think that we are this big professional funded institution. Oh no. For many years it was just me and Carmen. Now it's basically me and Arturo and Andrea. And we pull things together and people contribute and everyone does it for free. And we have this huge mix of writers from all nationalities, from a wealth of different countries. We have a lot of queer correspondents. We have a few transgender correspondents. We have people who are constantly challenging our frame of what we think we're doing in anti-racist activism, just because they know they can come to us and submit things. And this work is quality. Like, our people get quoted in the New York Times all the time. Our people get poached all the time, which is a big issue because, again, we don't have funding. So therefore, if somebody, change.org, decides that they really want to start paying people, then we're like, oh, God, we're down some writers. But we continually find this well of this great information. And one of the things I found is the way in which people hire, right? So, now that I have a brand, right? I have a name. Oh, it's LaToya Peterson. Now I can go places and people are like, oh, sure, can we hire you? Can you come work for us at NPR? They're one of my clients. Can you come work for Wikipedia? They're one of my clients, right? Wikipedia aside, because they're a new media foundation organization, so they have very interesting recruiting requirements, which they talk to me at length about, which I really like because it does contribute to more diversity. But new media aside, legacy media, they all want the same things. And I'm like, honey, I don't have a college degree. Did you realize that? I can still write. I still have an audience. I still have all of these things, but I don't have this thing that you're looking for. I didn't go to journalism school. I don't hang out in your journalism circles. None of your people would ever have referred me, right, if I didn't come in through this back door. So I think, to circle back to the original question in terms of people starting out, right, the first thing is to kind of understand where your limits are and understand where your strengths are. I think that's the biggest thing. A lot of people don't put enough time into understanding kind of like where they fit into the societal matrix. Like, do you need to get more training? Do you need to get more skills? Or do you have this really valuable skill? Like, one of the things that one of my friends told me is that they're always looking for minority business journalists. They're like, oh, there's not enough people who come out of B school and decide they want to go into journalism as opposed to going into private sector. So we're always looking. Oh, business journalism pays a lot. It's a good gig. Okay, try that one out. So figuring out kind of like where there are pockets in the market where you can fit into and understanding, because this is a market, mind you. Like, a lot of us get into it for altruistic reasons, right? I started writing for Racialicious just because I wanted to talk about race with other people who understood. That's the only reason I started doing it. And then over time, you start realizing, whoa, this is an industry. I deserve to get paid for my work. I deserve to have people advocate for me. I deserve to, there's all these things that you deserve as an employee. I deserve to know that I'm going to get paid on time. Big issue with freelancers. So all of these things will happen. So trying to kind of figure out where you fit, figure out where you can maximize your potential. Also learning to take criticism and learning to differentiate good criticism from bad criticism, right? Because that's the hardest thing to learn. It's really, really painful. I almost quit blogging in 2008 because I felt like I got ganged up on by a group of mostly women who did not agree with something that I wrote. And it was a nightmare for like 2-3 months, right? I almost quit blogging, and I was like, no. And my friend Carmen helped me through it. She was like, nope. She was like, just don't worry about it. Just ignore it. It's going to have to go away eventually. They can't keep it up forever, which unfortunately that was wrong, but whatever. There is never-ending animosity on the internet, but I did learn how to deal with it and to start parsing out things. People who were challenging core beliefs, core assumptions I made, core ideas, made me a better writer. And so I can look back at the stuff I was writing in 2006 and look at the stuff now and be like, whoo, don't read that, right? Like, I did something, this is a lot better now. And bad criticism about who you are, right? Your gender, your race, people think you're stupid. That's the go-to for women. Oh, you're so stupid. That is such an unsophisticated analysis, but we're all hearing the same things, okay? Like, it's like a form letter that they send out. Like, they just change, like, the name at the top, and they change, like, who they're sending it to. And it's, you idiot woman, whatever, right? So learning to distinguish between those two, because the first side kind of starts to slide off you after a while, like me, and after a while it just becomes funny, right? Like, it becomes so predictable. You see it so often that it takes something really ridiculous to shock you. My favorite anecdote with this one, I'm sorry, it's a little off color, but my favorite anecdote with this one is this guy who was sending us hate mail, and at this time he was sending it to Carmen Van Kerkhove, who was the founder of Racialicious. And he was like, this person is so angry and so bitter at the world because she has a big vagina, right? And we were like, that was a new one. Like, we had never heard that before. Everything else, like racial and gender slurs, we heard, like, everything else we were prepared for, but the big vagina, we were like, whoa, okay. And so Carmen cracked back. She was like, yeah, my vagina's so big, I carry my laptop in it. We were like, yes! And so if we ever reinvent our T-shirt line, there will be a big vagina T-shirt, just so you know. But like, learning to differentiate between these types of criticism, right? And laughing at some of the criticism that's ridiculous, because it is not you. It is this person. It is their insecurities. It is them trying to take out on you, like, their frustration at whatever's going wrong in their life.
I learned that during my life when I was a television anchor. I mean, I mean, I had that big time, right?
Right, and you're on screen, right?
So, yeah,
oh, God.
so let's see, when did I start anchoring? I guess it was like 1994. It was originally for NBC in Europe, and then BBC, international channel, BBC World. And it was interesting because for a while, I was in London, but we weren't actually seen in London because the cable channel just wasn't available there yet. But whenever I went abroad, so for instance, I was walking down the street in Dubai once. I was in Dubai for this kind of assignment or whatever, and suddenly a whole bunch of people were shouting my name, and there's a whole bunch of fishermen, on the street of Dubai. I'm like, what? This is really weird, and it was weird because they all kind of crowded around me, and it was kind of nice and flattering, but sort of scary too, and I did feel kind of a little. There's like 400 guys standing around me with and they all smell of fish and. No, I don't know. But anyway, it was kind of weird. But I used to get a lot of, fan mail and also a lot of stuff. The BBC had a policy, and then ABC News later, when I worked for ABC News and I did their overnight World News Now program. And, they were so funny because they would just keep your hate mail away from you. Because they didn't want it to mess with your head. Like what you were talking about how you almost quit and stuff. They just actively knew that it would mess with your psychology, it would mess with your head. You wouldn't really be able to go on and kind of perform. So they sort of protected you from that. But one of the things that I had to learn was to see myself also as a commodity in a weird way. I had to separate myself, me, the person, from this person on air. It was a different thing, and that was the only way I could really cope with it. Because the other issue that I had was the BBC. I used to get constant, it's Tommaso, for God's sake. Vitamin. Oh. Don't you know anything? That withering sort of British way. And I was sort of the face of commercialism, and it's the end of the world because the BBC's going commercial. They have an American accent. Oh my God! And so that was really weird, combined with being female. It was just crazy. And your bosses were like, I'm not sure I like that color of that jacket. Well, what about the interview I just did with Dick Holbrook? No. Well, let's talk about the jacket. And I used to get a lot of that, and it was just crazy. They cared about your hair, or your jacket, or did you have the right colored lipstick on? And I mean, oh, please. And what about the question I asked? And I remember it was really hard. We had this kind of double anchored thing where you had the boy and the girl and sat together and, the kind of thing. And it was really hard to land interviews. No, let me do the lead interview, please, on the big story. It was whether it's Oklahoma City bombing or whatever, all those stories. And I was on the air for, and you had to fight really hard to be able to do the interview, the serious interview. And it was tough. We were really pigeonholed, but it's progressed. I mean, it has progressed over time, but still, But yeah, you're a commodity when you're on the air, when you're blogging or whatever. You have to separate yourself.
Right, just the rage that people see, particularly people who are on television, right, or on YouTube, and unfortunately let's not talk about YouTube. People on television, all right, because there's all of the, when I went through training at the Women's Media Center, where they were teaching you, how do you become a media personality? How do you get on television, right? How do you formulate talking points, right? Which makes you sound like sound bites, which are really annoying to reporters, right? Because we're trying to get an actual answer, but are really great in terms of just an overflow spillage, trying to get your message out there way, because people tend to remember the talking points really well. And they drilled us. They're figure out what you're going to wear, figure out, test your makeup in the mirror, ahead of time, figure out how to position yourself. And it's why does all this crap matter? But it does, because people tend to take you more or less seriously depending on how you're presenting. And if you're presenting from a place that is different. So clearly men have a lot less to deal with women. White women have a lot less to deal with women of color, right? There are so many things that would be an issue, oh my God, an afro on air. Oh my God, she's larger than average. Is she plus size? We can't dress her. I could tell tons and tons of stories about that alone, right? But all of those things do matter, and your survival is almost predicated on learning how to deal with it, but not internalize it, right? Because you can start losing yourself with all this content, particularly with the constant feedback of the internet, but also I think in more traditional news environments too.
And you can also gain weight when you go into radio, which I did. I love radio for sure. Yeah.
And the other thing that I think women don't do enough is, and I also went through the Women's Media Center training where we talked a lot about this, is that, women don't do enough promoting themselves. Like, you will be good on TV, and even if you're not, I mean, who cares? There are a ton of bad people on TV, but they still promote themselves. They still pitch themselves to the bookers, and then they're on TV. So, promote yourself on TV. Promote, aggressively go after the interviews, and, play up your accomplishments, even if, women tend to downplay them, men tend to overstate them. And so, you don't need to be a jerk about it, but you can play it up a lot more, and that's something I think that traditionally women haven't done. I've noticed that a lot in the media with women applicants who are applying for jobs. The men put themselves out there a lot more, and so I think that will help more women too kind of get the jobs, get the attention, and play in that traditional media environment. Okay, so I'd love to go to questions now. Any hands? We have about 50 minutes left. We have a microphone. If you guys don't have questions, I'll ask more, but it'll be great if you do. Yay.
Hi, thank you so much for having the panel today. I was just hoping that you all could speak about pay, and especially online, because I think a lot of people would love to put their voices out there. When you were talking about, 100 contributors to one story, that sounds fabulous, but in order to do that, you have to be making money somehow, and I think that's how it shakes out in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, I can start with that. I mean, so first of all, in my Capital News Connection hat, our pay grades are the same for men and women. I mean, I'm very, very careful about that. It really is experience and a whole series of things. So that is absolutely sacrosanct. When it comes to online, because so many people work for free online, right? There's a whole, and when we think of it in terms of Newsit, and we think of what is the correct reward for participating and actually creating content online, it really, we're looking at it because we're doing a lot of collaborative assignments. We're looking at it that you have to give something, give everyone something. And it's an escalating series of rewards in this case, and so for the very best revenue share, and for the very, very best when we hire them. But down at the in the beginning, the folks who rate and rank, and they may snap a photo of the pothole, which is part of the story, or do whatever the story is going to be. A very active recognition and reward system, Foursquare and badging and all that kind of stuff, where people compete for that sort of thing. So to what extent is that kind of harnessable in news? But for the really serious contributors who are really good and have something important to say and are breaking stories, and that has to be recognized and it has to be valued. And I know this has been a controversy at the Huffington Post after, because a lot of folks did some great work. For you guys, I'm thinking of was it yeah, that's right. So she's like gone now, right? Because she never got a job, and she broke some big stories, for the Huffington Post. So it's a sensitive issue. You've got to reward people fairly for what they're actually contributing. But I don't know if that answers your.
Jump in.
This is my pet issue, so if you want to say something, go ahead. Okay. So coming from the online world, we do so much stuff for free that we are actually dragging down the market in the paid world, which sucks, because when you transition over, then you're like, why am I getting paid crap? And everybody's like, oh, because everybody else will do it for free. So what are you complaining about? We're going to give you $100. And so here are kind of like some quick tips in terms of figuring out how to negotiate and navigate with money, right? First, if you're not familiar with like Media Bistro, Writer's Market, get familiar, right? They'll give you a ballpark figure on what you should expect from different types of publications. Neither of those is completely comprehensive. There are a lot of places that are left out in each of those, but you can start to get an idea of how much each publication can pay. And it's really important for you to figure out kind of like who can afford to pay what, because sometimes you just can't ask for more money because it's not there. So if I'm writing something for a feminist site, like if you see me on Bitch Magazine's blog, I am doing that for the love, because they pay like $12 a post. It is ridiculous. I'm like, I cannot afford to write for you that often, but I will keep doing it because I love you. So feminist outlets, indie outlets, and whatever are notorious for lowballing. They pay $100 or less generally. And I've written for, if you look at my bio, I've written for almost everybody. So like all the lower end outlets pay less. As a general rule, online outlets pay a lot less than print. Print is where all the money is still. So when I go write for Vibe, or if I write for InStyle, or if I write for Essence, right, in those last two, like InStyle and Essence didn't even publish my article, still paid me the full amount. They were just like, oh yeah, sure, no worries. Just wrote it off, and I was getting, I think, $150 a word from each of those places, right? Whereas if I write online, I could, pour my heart and soul out, and I'm getting $250. And so start to try to figure out kind of who pays what, where that goes. Always ask for more money, even if somebody has said kind of, and this is hard. You have to work on your negotiation skills, particularly as women. Like, work on negotiation. Work on pushing yourself past your comfort zone, because you're going to need a lot of trial and error before you get good at it, so you might as well just start now. So ask for more money. Even if a publisher tells you, like, this rate is set in stone and we only pay everybody $200, right? See if you can negotiate that up. See, well, I'm doing more reporting. Can I get $250? I'm doing event coverage. Can I get $300? Can I get, like, try to figure out what's normal in your industry and keep trying to push the boundaries, because your boss will have forgotten probably what they quoted you back when you started writing for them. And if you don't say anything, they're not going to change it. You keep turning on your invoices for $200, they'll keep paying you $200. You got to keep asking. And then the last one, this is my secret torpedo. Find a buddy. Find somebody that's in your industry that trusts you and you trust them, and you guys share your salary information, right? Because particularly American society, we're really weird about talking about money. No one wants to ever, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. My girl, Megan Carpentier, right? She wrote for Jezebel. She went to TPM. Now she's at Raw Story. And we always call each other like, okay, how much did you get for this piece? Who did you just write for? All right, hook me with your editor and tell me how much I need to ask for. What happens with this? And that's how we make sure that we're at least getting a fair salary, particularly because Megan's been in editorial positions, so she knows the budgets of a lot of these places. And she'll be like, this is how much they can afford to pay, or this is how much they generally pay, or they're not flexible at all. But we each know going in because we sit there and do recon with each other. So find yourself a buddy, find somebody you can trust, talk about salary.
That's how I found out that some TV outlets pay. I never,
seriously.
I never thought to ask if I was going to get paid for a TV appearance till I was telling someone I was going to go on something. They're like, "Oh, sweet, they pay." I was like, "I have never been paid for this," and they're like, "Well, you just have to ask," and then they're not going to pay you unless you ask. So,
right.
And it seems to me that you should get a male friend to ask.
Right. Yeah. True.
Yes,
That's true. So it just depends on who you hang out with the most, clearly. Like Megan and I write for similar publications, but yeah, a male friend too, because guys will also do like really interesting things when they're tacking for salary that just don't occur. Because again, women aren't having these conversations. We don't sit around, oh, dude, that sucks, sort of. I used to have this jerky ex-boyfriend, right? He taught me so much, but he was a total jerk. And he talked about like bullying one of the lifeguards that worked for him into getting a higher salary because she had gone to the same pool management company he worked for. They were lifeguards, right? Same pool management company that he had worked for, and she had asked for a raise, and they were like, we can't afford it this year. All we can give you is 25 extra cents on the dollar, whatever. They had been working for about the same amount of time. I think it was 6 years, and she was making like $5 less than he was in the same basic job. And he was like, when he heard that, he was like, "Are you serious?" He goes, I come in there and I'm like, look, right here, boom, I'm going to go to this other pool company. If you don't pay me, and he's like, I just gouge him. They're going to give me 16, I give 16. I say 16, whatever. That is not always the best tactic to take, right? Particularly if you don't know where you stand in the company. With him, he had a very high, he had an operator's license, or all these things that made it so that he could have his pick of different companies. And if you need to know more, there's this really great book called Negotiation Genius. You guys should write that down. Negotiation Genius. This is a really great book that talks about kind of like evaluating, they call your best alternative to negotiate an agreement, figuring out kind of like anchoring points, like figuring out how to make deals, right? But he was able to come in hardball and say, you have to give me this. And so that way, even if he wasn't expecting it, he can come in expecting $10. He'll start saying 15 and see where that leads. Whereas a lot of us, we try to be reasonable. Like, I used to negotiate and say, oh, okay, well, the position pays, it says from $28,000 to $32,000. This is back when I had a job. $28,000 to $32,000. I'll ask for 30. Don't do that anymore. Up and above. Well, I normally work for 37, actually. I normally work for 100,000. Actually, I don't work for less than 50.
It increases your value when you do that.
Right.
When someone comes to me and says, no, I can only really do it for that, you think, you're sort of psychologically, you think, oh, well, that person must be really good. I mean, they obviously believe in themselves. It's an interesting, there's another book also too, Negotiating with Giants. That's a good one too.
Right. But anything that'll make you better in deal making, particularly if you're going to, like, as journalism is kind of blowing up, for a lack of a better term. A lot more of us are becoming independent contractors. There's a lot more freelance opportunities to be had, but a lot less career-type positions to be had. And so you're going to be the best advocate for yourself. And so you need to arm yourself as best as possible to figure out how to negotiate good deals. And it's not just about money either. Like, sometimes you might want to trade money for exposure. Sometimes you might want to trade, if they have something that you really want to do, like, you know, if they're part of a news organization that has a TV outlet and you really want to do TV, maybe you will trade, you know, working this kind of low-level entry gig in hopes of being able to be promoted to on-screen talent to do something else. So you have to weigh each situation and look at everything that's important to you and then figure out what deal you want to make from there. And be true to yourself. Like, it's really easy to short sell yourself because everyone, particularly in like video games journalism, right, which I love, it's such a glamour industry. Everyone wants to do it. That they're accustomed to paying people like 10 cents. They're like, what, you want to do this? You don't want to do it for free? Oh, well, why should we actually use you? And my friends who are actual successful game journalists never accept that. They're like, no, you're going to pay me for my work. You can go ahead and get, you know, free person off the internet if you want, but my analysis is tight. Everything is solid. I deserve to be paid.
Okay, so this question I think could obviously be answered by anyone, but it's probably more directed towards LaToya. You guys talked a lot about, I guess, front door access to journalism and back door access in media and journalism. But LaToya, you also mentioned gave a bit of a hint to like kind of what I would consider like the underground media when you mentioned RaffleCon and 4chan and things like that. And what I'm wondering is, like, I read your RaffleCon today, and it kind of, I felt, was addressing how to elevate diverse voices, perhaps, within the movement. But how do we make underground media actually something that people feel like they can even join? Because I remember when I was younger, and a lot of people, I think, in a certain age range, were very aware of things like, I'm thinking about Anonymous and 4chan vigilantism and kind of, or even groups like Sezadad, which brought news media out of Iran during the revolution. And a lot of people who are very connected to the internet and part of internet culture and consider that's part of their daily lives are very aware of these things, but it's sort of beyond the wall. I think it's almost like a bit of the ghetto of the internet, or an old boys, kind of new boys, perhaps. And
New boys, yeah.
And so I guess I'm just wondering what are your thoughts on making that so that like today's 12-year-old girl, or, you know, minority or urban or whatever, feels like they can also grossly make fun of people on 4chan forums.
Okay, well, I don't ride for that part, but but that's a great question, because it does speak to kind of what I feel like is the responsibility of those of us who care about media and social justice, which is, it's not enough for us to figure out how to transcend these barriers for ourselves, but we also have to not only reach back and start pulling more people over the gate, but figure out how to break down this gate in particular, right? So there's the frustrating part, right, for I think everybody is in social justice. Like, I try to publish a lot of the things that I found out, like, you know, I published this thing on like speaker fees, right, and like understanding how speaker fees break out, just to make that information visible. How do you get a book deal? Well, here's what I found out, here are the things that I know from it. And that helps make it visible in a very large way, but a lot of it is still really based on networks. So with me, it's always been kind of like infiltrating networks that are showing me things, right? Networks that I probably should not belong to. And I get into them anyway, and I have many, many stories about that. I'll tell them at happy hour. Infiltrating networks, and then creating your own networks, making sure you're pulling people through and pulling people up as well with you, introducing people to your editors, telling them who they're looking for, helping to coach people. I walk through everybody that writes for Racialicious that has ever expressed an interest in writing for freelance. I have tried to hook them up with editors. A lot of times I end up taking them to The Guardian, because The Guardian's a very easy place to break into. They pay $120 flat freight to everybody who does For Common is Free. I introduce people to my editor. I coach them, let them look at their pitches. I tell them, this is what's happening. And then in addition, try to figure out how to build more networks, build more things. So me and a friend, Matt Thompson, are working on a digital journalist of color mixer for NPR, right? Because NPR has had this issue with diversity for ages and ages and ages. And when Matt was filling a position, he was really upset that he was filling, it was a position for 12 different bloggers who were going to be paid, salary, all that jazz, right? And he was really upset that he could not find enough women candidates and candidates of color to fill some of these positions where he felt like it should have gone to someone, particularly the military blog. He was really upset about, because he was like, this is a conversation. When you look at the faces of the dead that are coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, right, these are young men of color. And yet the people who are reporting on it are overwhelmingly white. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't tell a good story, but it's a different story that would be told if you're looking at it through a different lens. And so he really wanted someone, and he couldn't find anyone. So we decided we're going to put together like this little task force action group and eventually expand it nationwide to get more people talking to digital media makers of color, to people who want to be into it, and to introduce them to, again, the networks that we know, and then hopefully push them out so that they can invite more people in. So we're hoping that a ripple effect will continue building and continue growing and continue moving. The other thing is, I think, transparency, right? Making certain things known. So one of the things that I didn't know when I started out, another one of those, when you send a pitch, right? I took the Media Bistro pitch class, so I paid $300. I got a pretty good, you took that too? Yeah, see, okay, endorsement. So we took the Media Bistro pitch class. My teacher was Kristen Kemp. She had written for a lot of magazines I wanted to write for, like Elle and Cosmo and stuff like that. Yes, okay. And I really liked that class. It was a great class. I learned a lot. Here's one thing she didn't mention. It's a lot easier to get your pitch approved if you know the editor, you know of the editor, or someone is going to refer you to the editor, right? You could put, War and Peace in a pitch and have it not be approved if it just doesn't get to the top of the slush pile, because editors are just really busy. One, they don't have time to sift through all the things that are coming in. A lot of people are pitching things that are just ridiculous. They're just, clearly you haven't ever read my publication, nor did you address it to the right person. Like, there are all these things that are happening. And so if you can find somebody that helps you cut through the noise, or you can figure out who the right person is for your pitch, so there's different levels of editors at magazines, everybody has different types of power. You want the person that has the power to say, hey, here's an assignment and I will pay you for it. That's the person you need to find. And so leveraging your networks to figure that out was a big lesson I had to learn that didn't come up in that pitch class at all. They never talked about the relationship that you build and being in certain networks. They didn't, my first clip ever came from Bitch magazine because I had met Lisa Jervis. And my second clip, which came around the same time, was from Anne Friedman, who was at the time, the deputy editor of the American Prospect. And she was a blogger for Feministing, and she was reading my work. And so she had reached out to me and said, hey, you should be in our magazine. Because I had been pitching unsuccessfully for about 4 months. I even kept like a little spreadsheet of all the places I pitched, so I knew where they recommend that, of all the places I pitched to figure out what was happening. And nothing was happening until Anne was finally like, here. And then once you get a clip, suddenly everybody else wants to talk to you. I pitched Vibe for 2 years without getting any kind of bite, nothing. And then all of a sudden a new editor came in, and she was just like, oh, I love your work. Can you write for us?
My experience starting out in journalism was so similar. So many letters and just writing. And finally, you just get to know someone, and then the minute someone says, "Oh, yeah, you should meet Melinda," and then suddenly it all happens. But I remember that. I remember just being so determined and not really caring about rejections or whatever. I was just going to do it, And you have to be super, super persistent. But you mentioned something really important. I just with my kind of employer hat on, and when someone sends me a note or an email and they spell your name wrong, they spell the name of the organization wrong, they clearly don't know what you do. Just don't waste my time, kind of thing. You know what I mean? But when you actually get someone who's actually researched what it is you do, has a good reason for what value they can bring, and articulates that well, it hits home, right? I really pay attention to that, and it's actually very rare. It's surprisingly rare, because I'm sure there's a lot of talent out there, but you have to take the time if you're actually looking to get noticed. That's really important. Just do your research, know who you're talking to, figure out a way that you can make a persuasive case that you're going to be really valuable to that publication or station or whatever, blog, but that's important.
Hello. I know that when you mentioned YouTube, you said, well, we're not really going to go into that, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts on vlogging as a form of political journalism and video blogging specifically on YouTube?
Oh, Lord. I hate talking about YouTube, but we'll go ahead and bring it in. YouTube is a great platform to be seen and to be noticed, and it's important to have a YouTube presence, even with other things, because a lot of people use that as a search box as well. So people will sit on the YouTube site and just search for various things, and so you want your stuff to pop up. All those things are important. I think my friend Jay Smooth puts together how I feel about YouTube in one very succinct soundbite where he talks about how every racist comment that's on that site is its own little special snowflake, and on YouTube it's like a blizzard. That's kind of what YouTube is. And if you ever look at are you familiar with Feministing? And you ever seen the Friday feminist fuck yeah or fuck you? About half those comments on YouTube are about whatever that person looks like and what they're wearing that day. Who cares about the message? Show more tits. It's just why do you do that? So just turn off comments if you're going to use YouTube, one. But two, it's important to be comfortable with things like videos and video making. One of my favorite I guess, internet icons is this chick named iJustine. I really like her because she's just like this, you know, I think at the time she started, she was like 20 years old, and she's in California, and, you know, no real special training, no real anything. And she decided to buy a green screen, right? And I'm like, who the heck just decides to buy a green screen? Like, I don't just go to Walmart and I'm like, yeah, I need, you know, some Raid, and I need some, you know, some toilet paper and a green screen. Like, I don't just think that, but maybe she did, whatever. So she buys this green screen. She spent $300. And she said she clipped it to like a wall just like this, right? She just like clipped it up. And she started learning how to make music videos of herself. She put herself in different backgrounds. The first few look really cheesy, as you would expect. And then she got good at it, right? And she got so good to the point where she has like thousands and thousands of followers. She's been able to parlay that into like walk-on roles with like CSI and other places. She's been profiled in Fast Company. Girl's got game. And it's all because of a $300 green screen that she taught herself how to use. So video blogging is a very powerful medium. Another good example is like the Young Turks. Who's the dude from the Young Turks? Cenk, yeah. Cenk from the Young Turks was able to parlay his YouTube-based political talk show into a guest hosting gig on MSNBC, right?
Now he has his own show.
Okay, even better, right? And he was also in Fast Company. And so people have been able to do a lot of really great things leveraging video platforms, particularly since as it's getting so much cheaper, as it's getting so much easier. So it's really kind of you and your skill. So if you want to hone that skill, particularly if you want to be on television or you feel like you might actually end up on television, which trust me, none of us plan that, and then you end up doing it anyway, protect yourself, learn early, figure it out. So yes, feel free to go forth into YouTube, just be aware of what happened. Alexandra Wallace should be a great example of why you shouldn't put everything you feel like on YouTube. She was the UCLA student that posted a rant about Asians in the library and was hit with like a tidal wave of kind of like the best of YouTube's misogyny and racism. So, you know, just be aware of what you're putting out there. Be aware that you're going to get more criticized, but also be aware that it's a very powerful platform that you can leverage.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. I have a question for you. You mentioned an interesting point about how diversity is kind of only given lip service. And we have a kind of a microcosm of that. I'm a student at American University. We've had 3 consecutive white male student government presidents. This year, we had 6 candidates running. I think we had 2 women, and 1 black man, and we had 1, I think he was Indian American, running. And the overwhelming favorite, again, was a white male. He was endorsed by the student newspaper, the incumbent president. And I'm kind of wondering what you think. First of all, kind of 2 questions. First is, what can men do to assist in this process of getting more women involved in media and also, I mean, politics and government in general? But I also want to ask, I asked the student government president who ended up winning was the white male. And I said, you know, it would have done more to your cause, who he was a big advocate of diversity, had he backed an equally qualified, diverse candidate.
It's just like these little unconscious biases that just persist in our society help lead people to think, well, some people are more qualified than others. Some of them are stereotypes. So like Asian Americans talk a lot about what's called the bamboo ceiling, or what they've termed the bamboo ceiling, which is how Asian Americans get to very high levels in business and industry and make more and have, on average, better education than their white counterparts, but they never make it to the C-suite. They never make it to the executive level. And this is because of the stereotypes people apply against Asian Americans. They're followers, not leaders. They're not innovative. They're good at copying, et cetera, et cetera. And it leads to that perception. So even if you have someone who's great, innovative, and creative, a lot of people will just pass. You know, that's just that type of person, right? They're not the right fit. It's harder when you ask people to actually tangibly sacrifice for their beliefs. So to ask this guy, you know, can you give up this student government board that you're in? I don't think you're going to get a very good response with that. However, I think it's a good thing to question what people will then do with that power, right? So you have this big stage, and you can make all of these changes, these questions. Who's your VP? Who's in your staff? What events are you doing? Who are the speakers we invite to the events at student government? How are we allocating our funds? Where have we gone? Like all of these questions that you can start asking that frame people toward more of a like social justice oriented mindset is important, because you don't want them to fix just that one surface problem, right? And that's what a lot of people do. They're like, oh, they complain there's 4 white presidents in a row. All right, next time we'll get a black guy. Done, right? This was kind of how the election went. But but you saw the problem. Or even better, the GOP like appointee. They were like, let's just get Michael Steele in. You're like, oh, did y'all think about that? Did you talk about that a little bit? No, it was fine to get the black guy in. And what happens is you don't ever address this structural problem, right? And so ultimately, you want to get to a point where it doesn't matter who the leadership is that everyone still feels represented. Because that's what the core issue is that people aren't being represented, that their thoughts are being left out, that the priorities that they have are not the priorities that are shared by the majority. And so people might start feeling marginalized. And you want to try to alleviate that as much as possible. And then I will pass to my co-panelists for the question on what can men do. Because I feel like we're going to have very similar answers. But
I just, really early on, I remember when I joined my student newspaper, and it was really intimidating, and it was a daily, and I just gravitated towards, I wanted to write, but I was a little shy about it to begin with. There's all these really important people in the, so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to do like a culture piece, which is like most of the women who joined the paper would start with these kind of culture pieces, or maybe do like an art or like lifestyle, and I just kind of automatically had shut myself. I really want to do hard news, but I defeated myself before I even started by saying, okay, well, I'll do an arts piece. And there was a guy on the paper who said, no, you, hard news, just go. I want you to go and do some student council thing or something, and there was some other big controversy, and just pushed me, which was hugely valuable. Like, if I think of like turning point, and that has happened at other points in my life too, where you have someone who sees your potential that you don't even necessarily recognize yourself because you don't have the confidence, you have all these societal inputs that are stopping you from even trying. So that's a great thing that a man can do, or like a white person can do. However you want to apply that paradigm. But yeah, absolutely.
Right, I think it's all, for each of us, it's just about questioning our comfort zones and where we are, calling yourself a feminist, which many men still aren't willing to do, and bringing up good questions, like why do we have the same person with the same color of skin and the same gender for 4 times in a row?
Right. Oh, and just to add one more thing too, also try to be a friend and an advocate to people that you see kind of struggling in your organization. Sometimes, just like great boss stories, I think we all have tons. Like one of my favorite bosses was this Republican white guy, which is even like night and day. We wouldn't have gotten along in any other circumstance, but he was awesome, and he taught me so many great lessons because he was not afraid to tell me what he saw as the truth, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I didn't necessarily agree with all of those world viewpoints, but he would definitely take up the time to tell me this is how the game is played. And when he realized that I was an asset to him, right, he would take me around and allow me to do things that were outside of my job, to teach me, just to be like, well, this is how this works, and this is what, big fancy law firm where everybody's making $400 an hour and up, this is what this looks like, and this is where, this is where you go and talk to the paralegals and talk to these people. Where I feel like people can make a difference in their friend groups and organizations. It's just by just little things, right? If a woman writes something that's really intelligent, say so. Put it on your networks. This is an awesome article. If there's a woman you really respect, I love Katha Pollitt, right? Amanda Turkle writes amazing political coverage. Say that, because people are normally only motivated to say something when they hate something, right? So you almost never hear, you'd be surprised at how few compliments I think any of us get, even though we all have solid reputations, just because people are more motivated to write about stuff they hate and stuff that they love. And then past that, if your friends are having this conversation about, here was my favorite conversation of last year. Serious literary fiction writers like Jonathan Franzen. Really? Really? But we'll get in that later. And one of the people rightfully called them out and said, there are no women on this list. There are no people of color on this list. These can't be the only, heir ascendants to Hemingway, really? This is it. But if people aren't talking about who they're reading and what they enjoy and what they like, or putting up alternatives like, you like James Joyce, you should read this new, Black Ulysses version that just came out, right? If you're not bringing out alternatives as well, people start to get a little bit lost, and they're like, well, what can I do? I don't know. No one's around. I don't see anyone. So helping to make people visible is also a really big part of the fight.
This on? This is basically a 2-part question. One is, what do you do with progressive organizations when they're only putting out men as their speakers, as opposed to the women that are on the staff? If you're really trying to get diverse voices, is there any responsibility that journalist organizations have? Or should organizations be more proactive in terms of getting the women who are their key speakers out there on there? The other part of it really is for many progressive organizations, I think many organizations in general are so pushing towards social media. What is happening with getting voices out there in whether it's going to be called mainstream media or legacy media. How does one get the diverse voices out there?
Well, I mean, I suppose as a news organization, you're always looking for, good people to talk to and like lots of different perspectives. But you can't, at the end of the day, if I call an organization and I want to speak to them, the organization is going to be the gatekeeper of, you can't get someone in trouble. Like you say, I really want to speak to that person, but if the organization isn't going to let that person talk, then you put them in a difficult situation if they go against their boss, you know what I mean? So like there's insofar, I mean, you can try as a media organization to be able to kind of quote people of diverse, and you can do that. You can consciously try, but at the end of the day, if the scenario described first, if this is our spokesperson and this is the only person that's speaking on our behalf, it's hard to change that, other than sort of politely suggesting that they consider changing it. I forgot what was the other part of your question?
Organizations are increasingly moving towards thinking that social media is the way to go, as opposed to the more hardcore, more, I don't know, legacy media that's not the quick, instantaneous turnaround. And how would what would you say to the organizations that want to get their voices out but think that social media is the only way to go?
I mean, it's an interesting question because maybe they feel that social media is ultimately more responsive because they can have more control of it just by virtue of the fact that it's social, right? And it's instantaneous and it has the potential of going viral and potentially a lot more impact. And if it does have impact, then it'll end up with the legacy media anyway, because the legacy media, as you were saying, I mean, is taking more and more its cues. Yes, absolutely, from social media. So social media is actually a very good strategy. I mean, if it rises to that. But I think if you're trying to get your message out, you need a diverse strategy. You need to kind of fight on lots of different fronts, right? From that kind of activist perspective. And you have to be able to figure out how to tailor your message in different mediums, in effect. So, a good way to go is have spokespeople that TV bookers are aware of. I mean, if you're talking TV, you really want to have relationships with the bookers. You really want to be sending out their kind of headshots and their bios, and you want to be able to react really quickly when there's news breaking that's relevant to your cause. So you can just get mind share, and you have to be persistent. You have to keep calling, even at the point of being a pest. Okay, so that's a good way to do it, because once you're on TV, then newspapers follow and all that kind of stuff. So that's one strategy, and that's kind of the older strategy. But again, it's persistence. But the social media, I think, is a very critical part.
I think it's two-sided with the social media thing, because you do need to have that presence, right? To be there, to be in conversation, be in dialogue, to figure out tips. It's just easier, makes your life easier. But there also has to be really great quality content to back that up, and you'd have to have places where people can go to read context and get things. So, from my blog, right? One of the things that we break all kinds of new media rules, right? No one's going to read past the 4 scroll pages. We routinely publish stuff that's 4 pages long, and our readers still read it because they like it, and this is where they're coming to for content. And each time we try to experiment, maybe we need a shorter article. They've all written back, no, we want the longer articles. So figuring out kind of where you're positioned. Also, you can tell your supervisors one word: TED Books, right? So TED actually mastered social media early on. TED is that conference where they have a lot of experts come and just talk for 18 minutes or so. It's normally 18 minutes, right? 18 minutes or so, and they put it up on the video and they transcribe it, and they have their Twitter feed. They had all of those things running and working as parts of the conference, and they've recently decided to branch out into what they're calling TED Books, which are kind of like novella length, maybe 50,000 to 99,000 words about a given topic. So people who want to know more can suddenly quickly and easily dive in and figure out okay, well, how are we going to demystify this whole alternative energy thing, right? So this is a new media organization that's looking at traditional media as a way to continue and solidify their customer base. From the speaker aspect of your question, one of the things that I love is that you kind of have to name a problem before people are aware of it. Because I'm sure they're justifying it to themselves all kinds of ways. We're using the best person, we're getting whatever, who knows. But if you start naming, did you realize that the last 7 people that we've put out as a Progressive Speakers Bureau are white people? Did we realize that this is happening? And just keep account. You know, this is the 8th. This is the 9th. You don't have to be obnoxious, but people start to get the point and they like freak out. So then the next thing they do normally after they freak out is they go, well, we couldn't find anybody else. There's no one else. This is a huge problem in the tech world. And somebody actually created a list that was like women to invite to your tech conference, right? If you have that much of an issue, you can Google it. It's up there. Women to invite to your tech conference, right? And here's a whole list. And one of our regular readers, her name is Erica Mater, and she's an engineer. She goes to a lot of social justice conferences. And so when she was at South by Southwest, her panel was on how to ensure a diverse tech event. And she talked about ways to diversify kind of your speaker lineup, ways in which people can look at, and how to rebut when your supervisors are saying things like, we couldn't find anyone else, we didn't have time, we already know him so well and we know he's a great speaker, because you're going to have rebuttals to all those things before you can start moving forward.
And I just wanted to add something. You know, I think sometimes you can be obnoxious about it, actually, and you should make a fuss. I mean, progressive blogs repeatedly call out the Sunday shows when John McCain is on every single Sunday show every single week. I recently did a story, as did some others, about how during the Wisconsin protests, it looked like not a single voice from the labor community was going to be on, yet Chris Christie, Scott Walker, and I think there was a third Republican governor from the Midwest was going to be on. And Richard Trumka ended up getting announced as part of the roundtable shortly later. We're not saying our stories caused it, but it did happen shortly after all the stories were published. And, you know, it just makes them aware that people are noticing, people are watching. So if you're seeing progressive organizations do that, you know, you should call them out, even if it's through an anonymous leak to a publication. As a journalist, I'm completely in favor of those. So definitely call them out.
Okay, this is the last question.
Hello, I'm from South Carolina originally, and I cannot tell you how many times I've had people ask me about Mark Sanford and Alvin Green, even months after the fact. And one thing I would say with progressive media and online and traditional media in general, when you talk about diversity, you get gender, you get race, you get class, but very rarely do I hear about region. And there were so many blogs in South Carolina that covered the issue extensively and well, but yet I still have people ask me what's going on with Mark Sanford, who's no longer governor, and Alvin Green, who didn't win anything. And when I see these big breakout stars or even these big outlets online and traditional, they tend to be from the Northeast. You might get a little bit of the Mid-Atlantic in there. Maybe Chicago, if you want to talk about the Midwest, and California. The bloggers tend to be from there, and the outlets tend to be located in those regions. So I'd like to get some of your opinions on the impact of regionalism in coverage, because I definitely see a cultural deficit in a lot of media.
That's a really good question. Yeah. That's a really good question. I don't have a good response to it, but it's a great question.
Yeah, no, no, go ahead. No, please. Well, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that we tried to do with Capital News Connection was address that problem, but from maybe the other way around. No one was reporting on Congress from a perspective of how it was going to impact locally. So, like, what does this mean? You know, so we pass this legislation, what's it going to mean in South Carolina as opposed to in, like, Kalamazoo, Michigan, or whatever? And we found that it was trying to figure out how to do that meant that we had to have good relationships on the ground with the public radio stations that we were serving. So we spent a lot of time, obviously, talking to the stations to make sure that our coverage was relevant to the folks in their listening area. The problem, of course, is who was in the public radio newsroom, and their perspective was, obviously different. So like when we, file stories for, Anita in Nashville, she gets something different from us than, Bob Beck in Wyoming, right? Very, very different sort of stories that they're interested in. But we got to the point where we really wanted to know a little bit. It wasn't sufficient to our local knowledge, and the way we were gathering it was pretty good, but not good enough. So then we thought, well, how can we find out a little bit more? And we launched this little web widget called Ask Your Lawmaker that let anybody ask any questions they wanted to their lawmaker and vote questions up the order, and then our journalists would go and get them answered. And the main reason for launching that was to get more local intelligence, because frankly, Congress and the way it works is a geographic representation. Every day people win and lose depending on, their regional winners and losers in all kinds of budget debates. And who's better at bringing home the pork or who's not, or, all those sorts of things, right? And it was interesting because the questions that came back really informed our thinking in the way that we would cover Congress. So it was a it works, but there's still not enough recognition. I think you raise a great question, and it puts me back to way back in my old TV news days where. So I start this job at ABC News, and the head of talent there is concerned that I am only going to work, because I was working for the BBC in London, and I had a slight little bit of English accent forced on me at the time, and I was just sort of trying to get that. She sort of thought, you're only going to work in New York and LA, honey. Like, you're just not going to, like, in the flyover. She actually used the word, in the flyover zone, and she used that with no irony. Like, she actually meant it. And that whole way of thinking really at that time, and I'm not sure if it still does, but I assume it does still pervade the sort of thinking that and what was really interesting is she was dead wrong, because every single person who wrote to me for the most part was either from like Alabama or Iowa or like anywhere but New York or LA. Like, she was totally wrong. But there was this arrogance of assuming that the only places that mattered were New York and LA.
Right, and to talk about assumptions, right? I love your question, because again, there's so many. You can distill it down to region. You can distill it down to disability. You can distill it down to class. You can distill it down to a variety of things. The issue is that, again, people are only looking at certain networks for folks to promote, for things to look at, for where they feel like news comes from, and it's a huge issue. There's actually a mirror to that issue in the tech world, right? Because Black Web 2.0 came out with a study in terms of like, why aren't more venture capitalists investing in black-owned startup firms, right? And so they had this huge study, and one of the great takeaways from the study was, despite the fact that most minority entrepreneurs never saw a dime of venture capital, about 23% of our startups were operating with revenue, as opposed to like maybe 9% of like traditional startups, like white-led or mixed teams of like white and Asian American. So we thought that was really fascinating. And then more so, they talked about how incubation centers, right, where venture capitalists look to invest, they tend to look in the same places: Silicon Valley, New York, mostly Silicon Valley and New York. Like, everywhere else is not really, or sometimes LA, a couple other random spots, but Silicon Valley and New York. And they found that black entrepreneurs were launching their successful revenue-generating web startups from places like Texas, Atlanta, South Carolina, right? And so the recommendation that came from the report was that venture capitalists had to start widening the scope and looking outside of the usual suspects. And I think that same thing applies in media, right? There are so many different ways that we lock people out with prejudice. Like, I was at a training, right, where someone was talking about, how people train their whole lives to get a Midwestern accent, right? Not because Midwestern perspectives are valued, but because they feel like that appeals to the broadest base of person, that you don't have any trace of a regional dialect, right? Which to me is completely jacked up because, right, I'm local to D.C., but since D.C. has so many different regions in itself, right, you could sound completely different. My cousins who grew up in Southeast sound different from my friends in Baltimore. And even how you pronounce Baltimore. It could be Baltimore, it could be Balmer, it could be, I never even heard of Balmer until recent. I was like, what, right? Because I always heard of Baltimore, right? That's just how you pronounce it. And so, but those things are interpreted by people as a deficiency. They're never interpreted as a benefit or something. And this conditioning is so insidious. Like, no one ever really says, oh, Northerners are smarter than Southerners, right? But that's the assumption. That is the thing. And I was like sitting here in this training, and this woman's like, if you sit down and you ask somebody and they offer you, oh, sugar, do you want some sweet tea? Right? And she was assuming something based on the set of, mostly black journalists that were sitting there. She was assuming that we had bought into that same thing. Meanwhile, we're all confused. We're like, actually, I would like a glass of sweet tea. And and it's like, it sounds, sounds like my own. Sounds like me if I'm drunk. I mean, it just is what it is. But again, when more of us are breaking through, I think that's the only way the change is going to happen, because there are so many avenues to fight on, and it's just so easy for people to keep defaulting back to what's familiar and what they know. We could take a chance on the Southern blogger, but let's just go with that guy. We know what we're going to get with him. In that book, Negotiation Genius, one of the things they talk about, like negotiating in an irrational world, is talking about dealing with people's biases. And they give you like this little test that Harvard had developed to figure out implicit bias and figuring out like how you notice that. And they recommend for all deal makers to really examine your assumptions and your biases, to make sure that you're not overlooking someone that's excellent just because of something that's lodged so deep within you, you don't even recognize it on its face. So unfortunately, there's no great answer to your question, I think, at this moment. I think it's part of that ongoing battle where we fight to have everyone acknowledge for kind of who they are, what they say, what we're contributing to the conversation, and not whatever stereotype someone is putting on us.
Well, thank you all, and hopefully you'll come over to the happy hour, which Kay will tell you about.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think they deserve a round of applause, right? Thank you so much. So you guys are free to head over to the happy hour. It's over at Laughing Man, which if you don't know how to get there, you'll just take a left when you get outside of the building. You'll take a right on 13th Street and then another right on 2G Street, and you should see it. It's on kind of the far side of the street when you're approaching it. So thank you all so much for coming once again. Have a good evening, and thank you again to our panelists.